Hello, welcome to Pobsa's Dharma Lounge. This is a place and a time for us to investigate all things Dharma. Sit back, relax, maybe pour some coffee, tea, or whatever, and join me in this exploration. Hello and welcome. I'm Pobsa Frank Jude, and today we're going to be beginning what I am hopefully planning on becoming a little bit of a mini series with Barrie Risman. We're going to be doing these unrehearsed conversations around themes from her book, Evolve Your Yoga. But first, I want to thank all of you who have been sharing about the podcast. If you know of anybody, the best way to really get this out is word of mouth. So please let people know about the podcast. If you haven't subscribed, please do. That makes a big difference. Subscribing, commenting, rating where possible. And then, of course, there's always the option of Dana. So all different ways of supporting the podcast, all different ways of truly being appreciated. So I look forward to our conversation with Barrie Risman today and hope that you find it of value. Thank you. So welcome, Barrie. Good
Thank
to see
you
again. Thanks for joining me in this. We'll see how it goes, but evolving your yoga. As we said when we first talked, I really love the way that you laid out your principles in the book. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought they could be, each and every one of them, a really great template for or foundation for discussion. And so I'm glad that you decided to join me in this. And obviously the first one that you had is Evolve Your Yoga. And each chapter you have a little epigram, and the more I look at this one from Goethe, the more it seemed to like a kaleidoscope, offer more and more ways, because like there's obviously the epigram is we must always change, renew, rejuvenate ourselves, otherwise we harden. And you know, there's lots of ways that we can take that, obviously. And just recently I really started thinking about the tendency we have to kind of reify our experience, right? And nail it down. And we do this even with identity. Like the other day I was talking to someone, it's like, why is it that if someone who has been generally honest says one lie, they become a liar? Like that's their whole nature, you know? And so this idea of like going against that tendency to reify, especially specifically with yoga practice, I think is really a valuable thing to investigate. So what did you have in mind when you were talking about evolving and change?
Well, the book is really about the principles and themes that will help really people who've been doing yoga for a while, continuing students, to deepen their practice. So it was really within that context that I wrote those principles. So evolution in that sense is really about how do we change the way that we use our yoga practice and even the form that it takes to meet where we are in our lives, which is always changing. And also the idea of evolution being a continual process and movement toward deepening. So I have that, you know, the symbol of the nautilus shell, which for me really beautifully illustrates that idea of how we evolve in practice over time. So it's not, you know, to your point, it's not about always doing the same thing or thinking this is my yoga or this is what I do that I consider yoga. but really opening to the fuller spectrum of what yoga practice can be about. And in that process, finding ways for it to meet us no matter what's going on in our lives, and using it in more and more evolved ways.
Yeah, I really like the Nautilus shell image, because I used to always talk about that too, because I know therapists hear this all the time, but like even as students would say, I thought I dealt with this before, and it's like things come back, but it's more like a spiral. So, it might be the same issue you thought you dealt with 5 years ago, but again, deepening it or revisiting it from where you are now, it's not the same thing. It can't be the same thing. Just yesterday, I was talking to a friend about how, when we watch a movie or read a book for the second time, it's always different because we're different,
Yeah, and that's certainly the case with yoga practice.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it can feel the same. That's for sure. The themes that come up in our lives, it tends to feel, oh, here this is again, and so it can feel the same. So I think it is important to recognize that we're always different, right? And so again, thinking about it in the context of yoga, I think that's very true with yoga practice, right? Whether it's meditation or postural practice, that when we're paying attention, it's not the same, because we're not the same.
Yeah, exactly. And that goes, like you used a word about relation. Swami Satchidananda, years ago, in 1977 or 8, when I was taking classes at Integral, he said yoga is relationship. And over the 40 some odd years of practice, that one thing has, talk about deepening. Now I understand it at a way different level than I did, when I was in my 20s. But like how we are now, right, should be reflected in our practice. And I see so many times with I was an Ayurveda counselor for a while, and people would have like food guidelines that they were given like 15 years ago. I was like, you're not the same person, it's like, but that goes back to my point, like we kind of like nail something down. This is what I am, and so like recognizing that if it's a relationship, our practice should meet us where we are, and where we are is always changing. The idea of deepening, and you have been right, like what's an advanced posture, right? In most yoga classes, which probably, sadly, might be better called asana classes, usually deepening means going a little further in the posture, and like knowing that, I sometimes play with that idea. Maybe we're like an extended side angle, and we'd get into it with the modification with the forearm on the thigh, right? And usually people are, all right, now if you want to deepen it, bring your hand to the floor, and I'll like just say, all right, if you want to deepen this, what's going on in the inner right groin, or the inner right thigh, or the outer edge of the back foot, and not having to change the physicality of it, but really going more internal in the experience.
Yeah. I think that is certainly what I think of as an advanced practice, and certainly what that means to me, as I age and my practice becomes less performative and more functional. So not necessarily more advanced in, how far I can get my leg behind my head, but how present I can be, how accepting I can be. This whole idea of edges in practice is really interesting, because we tend to think of the edge, as the physical edge, like how deep can we go, just before pain, right? And how to, or we hit the frontier of our stretch, right? And that was typically the way that Joel Kramer wrote about edges in practice in the 70s, right? Where is that frontier, right? Right before we get injured or before we get scared, and how do we work against those edges and expand those edges? And I also have to say that, I wrote the book in 2018. I finished writing the book in 2018. So my understanding has evolved over the years. since then. And I consider different edges in my practice now. It's like, how accepting can I be of, you know, what I'm working with in an aging body? How compassionate can I be toward myself? Right. So there's these other edges that we can work with. And I think that there's so many ways we can define what an advanced practice is. And you know, I write in the book about the most advanced pose I ever saw was BKS Iyengar practicing shoulder stand, where his body was, I mean, first of all, he was completely still, and it went on for minutes and minutes and minutes and minutes. And I was in the room with him at that time, and every time I kept looking back, it's like he hadn't moved. And so there was the steadiness of it that was incredible. But also it was like every pore of his body, there was consciousness coming out of every pore in his body. It was like glowing. You know, you could just see it. So that idea of taking the mind deeper into the body is certainly a feature of advanced practice, maybe the most important one. How sensitive can we be? How present can we be? How do we bring the mind into these different corners to awaken the consciousness in the body? And that is something that I think is overlooked a lot in the kind of the modern drop-in yoga culture in the West.
It's interesting. I hadn't named it this way, but like, you know, as you said, like this idea of the edge usually meaning physicality, but really it's also the mental boundaries we have. In the four Brahma Viharas, which are also known as the immeasurables in the Buddhist tradition, you know, you might reach your edge when you're supposed to send loving kindness to the quote enemy. That's one of the categories of the difficult. I usually just call it the difficult or challenging person. I mean, that's an edge. I've had students say, like, even, and then fill in the name of some politician who I'd rather not mention right now. I was like, yeah, that's supposedly where the direction we're going in. And like, if you've got that edge now, honor that edge. I mean, what a lot of people will you know have to work with then is like, there's no way I can send friendliness or loving kindness to that person. Can you accept that without getting into self-recrimination? All of that is edge work, you know, on a mental level.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, you know, when we talk about evolution, what you were saying earlier about just recognizing that we're not the same, you know, when we come up against those edges, it's like, where are we right now? And so perhaps one way to think about evolution in yoga is how open we can be to that truth. Right? Like just how we meet that from where we are.
And you saying that makes me realize there was a question that I think would be really powerful, or at least helpful to look at rather. You know, we're talking about change, and you've been practicing since the early 90s, or and I go back to the 70s, and it's like, all right, so over that period of time, I can tell you there's been lots of changes. You know, at one point I was doing things that I'll probably never be able to do again for this lifetime, and physically. My mental understanding has shifted. So lots of change. What stayed the same? Has anything stayed the same? And if so, what do you feel for yourself? Because I started to think about that. I was like, all right, has there been anything from the beginning that is still there, like a through line?
Well, you know, it's a really interesting question because there's different ways to look at it. So when we think about evolution, like the evolution of a species, it's the adaptation to external responses, right? To external conditions. That's how species adapt, right? By over time. So that's one way to think about change in yoga. It's like, how do we adapt or shift or evolve our practice to meet what's going on in our outer lives? And then there's also, from the inner perspective, the inner evolution, right? And so I think that for many people that does change, because a lot of people, as we know, we come to yoga for the physical practice or for stress relief. And for some people that doesn't change, right? It's just like yoga is something we do, once a week, or we learn a particular breathing practice that helps us, and it kind of stays there and it serves us in that way. But I think when we're talking about like spiritual evolution or personal growth or self-development, however we want to look at it, like our own inner evolution, I think that does change. And I don't know what makes it change or not, right? Like I came to yoga because I wanted for the physical practice, hatha yoga. We both started at the same studio. So remembering back to those days.
Hail to world yoga.
And I came because I enjoyed the physical benefits, and I started to notice that it was helping my mind and my emotional state. And then something switched, and I don't know what turned that switch on, where I wanted to understand more about who I was. And I had the sense that yoga could help me, in that. So I think, I think from that perspective, it does change. I mean, the yoga tradition, would say the state of yoga is always there, right? It doesn't change. It's just our experience of it and our relationship to it changes.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of different ways we could answer that. And I think, I guess from the Buddhist perspective, the answer would be different.
Well, yeah, when I started to think about it, it's like, is there anything from, I'm trying to remember what it was like in 1976. And, in my case, there was literally only a matter of a few months between my first yoga class and my first time in a zendo. And part of that was because I sought both really to deal with dukkha, and so since then, my understandings of the practices, even my understanding of dukkha has shifted, but in some ways it's still about how to live with and engage with the existential nature of dukkha in one's life. I mean, and so like, is that some thread for me? I'm not sure, but it's like that really has been right from the beginning. Like I knew that I was seeking that, a way of dealing with that, and the relationship to it definitely has shifted, but that's still what keeps me going. It's like I was trying to think, well, all right, after almost 48 years, what keeps me going? And it's that engagement. But now I don't even think of dukkha as something to escape. As a naturalist, I don't really believe in a transcendent kind of quality, but it's Thanissaro Bhikkhu translates dukkha as stress, right? And he says, when you hear the First Noble Truth talked about like life is stressful, there's a lot more like, because like sometimes when they hear dukkha translated as suffering, it's like life is suffering. Really? All of it? No, so like, but life is stressful. And then, I teach a mindful stress management course up at Miraval, and it's like, there's eustress and distress. You can't have life without it. It's like when we go into a yoga class and we do Jana Shishasana, we are creating tensile stress on our muscles. Every time we stand up, it's compressive stress on our bones, and we need that. So like, it's less about avoiding dukkha and more about dancing with it. Shifting might change and all that, but it's still an engagement with it. So I don't know.
The relationship. It comes back to that idea. It's our relationship to it, right? That, there's a dynamism to life. I mean, that's, from the yogic perspective, right? That everything is, it's constantly in motion and moving, and there's a dynamic quality. So it's not still, it's not static. And so it's always about how we are in relationship to whatever's happening. But I think, your point about that through line for you is some way to understand the stress or be in relationship to the stress of your life that is more easeful perhaps, or supports well-being. That is, I think, a pretty universal human longing, right? Like, so
Yeah.
maybe, so I think that's one thing that doesn't change, no matter how we seek to answer that question, right? Or that resolve that issue. We're all looking for some
Right.
way to deal with the stress that's inherent in life. So I think that that's perhaps one thing that doesn't change. And also, I think that it's like the teachings in a certain way don't change,
Mm.
right? Like that stays the same. Our relationship to them changes, hopefully evolves,
Hmm.
perhaps deepens. We understand it more. We're able to hold it more in who we are in our lives. We can feel connected to the wisdom of whatever tradition we relate to. We can feel disconnected, but those things, that doesn't change.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. That makes me think about how I've often said, it's not like there's something new here. If I look at Dharma talks I've given over the last 10 years, and I've been saying the same thing, um, and basically I'm saying what my teachers said, and it's filtered through my own experience. So there's differences that way, but like the core is there. Um, and so it's kind of interesting because now in the capitalist marketplace, everybody seems to want to make it sound like it's unique and different and repackaging and branding and all, but it's it's really just the Dharma. It's like
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so I think that's our challenge as teachers also, is to find different creative ways, because it's the marketplace. Yes, absolutely. And I think it's also the mind wants new, fresh ways of looking at,
yeah.
different things, we convey things differently. So I think that's the challenge of the teacher, right? Like, how do we make it fresh? Because we're still saying the same thing,
Hmm.
um and how do we say that in new ways? And I think what you said is really the key to it, which is speaking from our own experience, which is always changing and evolving and shifting. And so that, even though what we're saying is, not changing, the way that we're relating to it, and I think the energy it carries is fresh.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's, you nailed it there. It's like, that's the challenge. And in that way, and your second principle is be a student. And it's like the teacher needs to remain a student as well. It was recently the anniversary of Georg Feuerstein's passing, and he was both a teacher and a friend of mine. And one of the teachings he gave, without being a conscious teaching on his part, was when I was a student in the yoga teacher training, the only one he ever did in 2001 and 2002. We were at Mount Madonna, and Georg, although he was a yoga scholar, was a practicing Buddhist in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And he knew, and at the time I was in seminary to become a Zen teacher, a Pobsa. And I also have a lot of grounding in the Theravada tradition. So when we got to Buddhism, because it was the yoga tradition that he was teaching. So he was teaching from the Hindu tradition, the Jaina tradition, and the Buddhist tradition. They are all what he would refer to as yogic cultures, right? With their own language, with their own art, their own architecture and all that. So not just, he didn't think of it in terms of religion so much, right? And so when we got to Buddhism, he hired me to teach on Theravada and Zen, and he just taught the Tibetan. And I was like, wow, like, as a teacher, he recognized that there was an area where I might be able to offer something that he couldn't, and he just, no ego involvement at all. He just invited me to teach. And I've always kept that in mind, because it's like, I know when I was younger, especially, there was a tendency I would like go into a yoga class and half as a student, but half as like a teacher, like wanting to see how I can work with it. And it really put me out of it. So now I go in and I put that aside and I just, all right, I'm going to do this and see what the teacher has to offer and try to be a student, you know. One of the things that I think maybe before we dive into talking about studentship, because I think that's really important and way overlooked currently, is your epigram for that comes from Richard Rosen, who was our pranayama teacher in that Georg training.
I was going to say, I'm sure he was involved in that training.
Yeah. The more you learn, the less you know. The more you learn, the more you learn that there's more to know. The subject of yoga is enormous, and I'll never come to the end of my studentship. I love that passage because it's like there's what we know, what we don't know, and what we don't know, we don't know, as it's been said, you know. And it's like there, and in Buddhism, there is this concept called the don't know mind. And my teacher would often repeat this phrase of like, the don't know mind is most intimate. Because if we really think about it, when we don't know something, if we're interested in it, especially, right, we pay a lot of attention to it, right? And then as soon as we have a sense that we know, or we think we know, we lose some of that intimacy because, and we might take people even that we know for granted, or get into automatic pilot mode. And it's really a challenge, talk about another edge, to try and keep that intimacy of the don't know mind. I'm thinking in particular at the end of many of my classes, you know, people are in Shavasana, and sometimes I end to get them out of Shavasana by wiggling the toes and fingers. And people usually immediately just, you can see that they're not there, right? Automatic pilot mode. Mm-hmm. And so I will sometimes say, all right, like I would explain don't know mind. I was like, can you really? And then all of a sudden, what if I do that first? They start doing things like this, and you can feel the questioning, you know? And it's like, how do we encourage that when there is that tendency to just like go, you know, talk about evolving? It's like, I know it, and then that's it. We reify it, and we don't continue that quality of engagement.
I think it's really hard. I think it can be overwhelming for people to invite that, to really step into that place of giving up, like relinquishing, you know, what they think they know or what they've learned. It's like, you know, when people ask me questions about the history of yoga, and I say, well, there's still a lot we don't know, you know, and if you really want to learn about yogic development and yoga philosophy, you have to get comfortable with like not knowing, and that it's not linear, and that, you know, that, and it's really tough for the Western mind, I think, especially now when there's so much information, and we're just all dealing with, our nervous systems are dealing with so much. And it's like, and now I have to, you know, it's like we're just trying to hold on so often and stay grounded in this like crazy world. And then I think it can be really overwhelming to, if you're not used to it, right? It's kind of like a muscle. You know, like your practice has trained you over the years. My practice has trained me to, you know, hopefully be able to let go of a little bit of my ego. And I think, you know, because that's where the discovery is. And you know, there's a level of comfort and safety in that. But I think it can be scary for people in the modern context. And I also think that there needs to be a level of trust. Like if I let go, am I just going to get lost? Like, am I going to come back? Am I going to get lost? You know, I just think that there's a difference in the context for practice today that makes that hard and scary sometimes.
It's hearing you say that reminds me of years ago, my teacher, Samu Sunim, he created a curricula for Zen, to become a Zen teacher in Asia and in most quite frankly, most places in the West, if you're in a Zen community, it's very much like a mentorship, and it could take decades sometimes before a teacher feels that you're ready to be a Dharma teacher and all that. And there's a lot of subjectivity and power dynamics in it. And so Sunim said, all right, here's a curriculum of study, which involves ceremonial stuff, academic stuff, practice-oriented stuff, right? There was a whole matrix of study. And basically the contract was, you do this and you complete it all, you get ordained. So we knew what we had to do. That was his concession, he said, to the Western mind. But then after that, it was like, he was like, he felt that we, like, you know, people would say, not in that training, but like that mental state of like, is this going to be on the test? Because then I'm going to pay attention, right? Or like needing things to be explained. For instance, we would chant the Heart Sutra, and I think it was a good year before he gave his first lecture on it. And most Westerners want to know, what does it mean right from the beginning? And he was like, create your, you know, like cultivate your own experience to the sound of it, even just the energy of it. And then we'll discuss it, you know? And it's a very different way, but I found it really a much more direct over time, like, you know, giving over to it. And when the lecture started, it was like, there was a deeper way of understanding. It's hard to put into words, but it was like, oh, this would not have meant anything a year ago to me, you know?
Yeah. I think, you know, what you're talking about, what makes me think it's like, it's the difference between teaching to the mind, you know, like the intellectual understanding that really benefits from structure and knowing the starting point and the ending point. And then teaching to that deeper level. Through the experience. It's like you had the experience of the sutra by reciting it, by, you know, just the sound of it and the repetition of it and the practice of it. And then the mind could kind of grasp it on a deeper level. Yeah.
So that brings me to, in that chapter, the thing that really struck me, because I've been thinking about this at least since 2009 or so, when I started to really see a shift in yoga teacher trainings that I was faculty of, is the difference between a student and a consumer. And this has ramifications really broadly, because it's not just in the yoga world. I mean, I have many friends who are professors at universities, and they have said that, you know, and some of them are older, so they see generational change, right? When they started teaching, it was like students were students, right? Now, somewhere along the line, they became customers, consumers, right? And you know, the capitalist maxim, the customer's always right. So there's been a shift in the way teachings are done and the content of teachings that I think really end up not serving the student in the long run. And I've seen this in the yoga world, where it's like, you know, the first trainings that I was ever a faculty member on, people were hungry to learn. And by 2010, for sure, it was like, they wanted the certificate. And there was a shift in that. And what I found is that the people who were running the teacher trainings, sadly, you know, they probably needed to do the teacher trainings because, you know, the economics of running a yoga studio. Jay Brown talks about this a lot in his podcast, that, like, you know, yoga teacher trainings were what were needed to just get out of the red. That shifts the relationship, again, back to relationship between teacher and student, where the teacher then wants to just satisfy and appease. And I saw that happening more and more.
Yeah, so then that affects the content of the training.
Very much
Because
so.
you want, as a business owner, So one of the anecdotes that I tell in the book is, when I owned my studio, we didn't have a receptionist, so it was the teacher behind the desk, selling the class cards, and then the teacher in the studio. And so I would sometimes joke with my students, because we would have those, the credit card machine, and when the student would pay for their card, it would come up with a message that would say pass the terminal to the customer, and then pass the would tell the person, pass the terminal back to the clerk. And I would say, yeah, here I'm a clerk, but when we go in there, I'm the teacher. And, we would joke about it, but it was, then that was how I started thinking about it. And in fact, just this morning, I got an email from someone who was referring to my retreat participants as clients.
Oh.
And it just jumped out at me. I was like, I get it, but I don't think of the people that I teach yoga to as clients at all. Although I know a lot of teachers do. So I think, and one thing that comes up is I think the shift. Well, I think there's a lot to say about this. I think one thing is it comes down to the basic conflict between yoga and in a capitalist marketplace, like teaching yoga and making a living teaching yoga, having a business of teaching yoga, so to speak, is at odds with yoga, with the ethics of yoga, actually, on a certain level. So I think that's one thing, is like we've put it together, and so it's an awkward relationship, relationship, right from the beginning. I think one of the shifts I've seen over time is the unraveling or the shift away from the authoritarian yoga teacher culture toward a more egalitarian culture, which I think is needed and great, and yet has shifted, and somehow we think we don't need to learn or have a teacher, actually, this idea that we teach. It's such a strange thing. It's like, as teachers, at least the way I teach, it's like, it's not about me that I teach. It's I want the student to awaken their own inner wisdom. I want my teaching, and I want to facilitate the process of helping them get in touch with, yes, a kind of inner teacher. That doesn't mean that we can't benefit from having someone teach us, right? Yeah. That there's a way that studentship in yoga is, there's a subtle understanding, I think, a nuanced understanding that's required to really get the most out of it. And I think that's the last thing that came up as you were talking, is that it's not for me that I want people to be students. It's that when we see ourselves as consumers of a product or a service, when we see yoga as a service to be consumed, or something to receive in that way, we would just really miss out on the depth of the practice. It's like we're not able to really take it on as our own.
Right. And I hear you say that, and in one way, what distinguishes it, like if I buy something, right, or I go to a restaurant, obviously I want it to be pleasing to me. And the fact of the matter is, sometimes we learn things, whether it's in university or the yoga studio, ideally, that we might not like. It's not the same. Like, I'm not saying like, just like put up with it and everything else, but it's like, again, it rubs against our edges, like to hear something. And it's like, and that's what I think is happening, is that student gets upset or offended and everything else. And we see it happening in so many universities, where like professors are put on, they're fired sometimes, or they're suspended and all that, because they've taught something that a student got upset about. It's like, I remember when I was in college reading things that were really upsetting, and then being asked to respond, right? And now it's like there's this real fear of that, I think. And in the yoga studio, here's one example. I mean, the first 10 years I was on a faculty for a particular yoga school. One of the things I teach, I mean, first of all, the Four Noble Truths. Life is stressful. That's the first noble truth, right? Or dukkha. But like one of the practices is the five remembrances. And the Buddha taught this practice basically to wake us up from complacency, right? It's like I'm on the nature to age and there's no way to avoid it. Illness, no way to avoid all illness. Death, no way to avoid it, right? And then the last one is my actions are my only true belonging. And you know, it's like a very empowering, but it could also be a little scary to recognize that our actions really do have impact. Mm-hmm. And people, and like in the first decade or so of teaching, the students were like, you know, yeah, we would share afterwards, and it was like, it was really uncomfortable thinking about death, but like they would engage with it, you know. Of course it is initially. And some people had liberatory experiences. I remember this one woman saying, it feels so freeing to hear a spiritual tradition admit these things, because so much of my spirituality has been trying to like, you know, not. And then like in one training, ironically in Montreal, I know that's where you're based, right? Mm-hmm. I did this training, and the first person to raise their hand and share is like, I come to yoga to avoid this. I knew my time was going to be limited from that moment on.
Yeah, so that puts us in a really awkward position if we want to teach the practice, because, you know, as you said, the goal of the teacher is not to make the student necessarily feel good. It's to help them learn, right? So are we teaching to this level, you know, in the yogic language, you know, we would say, are we teaching to you know, to the ego, which actually is going to strengthen that, you know, or are we teaching to hopefully support the student to find a lasting, you know, sense of well-being. Mm-hmm.
And ironically,
that isn't about feeling good. You know, one of my favorite quotes about meditation is, meditation gives you the power to be happy even when you're sad. Mm-hmm. You know, it's like, how do we, so what are we teaching to in the student? And I think one of the things is for the reasons you mentioned, the transactional nature, not just of yoga practice, but of training teachers, has made it really hard to create a safe container within which we can really go deep in that way.
Yeah. And ironically, you know, I've seen students come out of a very vigorous physical thing feeling like they've been beaten up, but that's okay. Right. But like create a little mental upsetting discomfort, and that's not okay. It's very, very curious.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, when I interviewed teachers for my book, you know, several of them told me they started doing yoga out of like self-hatred, like to punish themselves, you know? And so there's that, you know, there's a whole psychological dynamic at play there too. That's not, you know, but certain yoga cultures actually reinforce.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So again, I think that, So I think that's a very real dynamic. And I think you and I, one of the things we have in common as teachers is developing relationships with students over time, that allows us to create that space where we're able to support people. Like when you were talking about, you know, the last Brahma Vihara in Sanskrit is upeksha, the equanimity, or the, you know, spaciousness sometimes is translated at. In my recent retreat, we were able to work with that. And I actually led them through a practice that Thich Nhat Hanh developed, bowing to our adversaries. And it was so, and I was sort of like, I was sort of, it was a 5-day retreat, and I wasn't sure. I was like, can we really go there? Because it's a hard thing to do, to actually thank your enemies and to recognize that they are actually your teachers, and to use that as a practice. And so, but on the second to last day, one of the participants just said, I'm so angry. I'm just so angry at what's happening in the world. And I just, she was like, just come. She was able to just really allow this anger and frustration to come up. And I don't know how to work with it. I don't know how to forgive these people. And so I led them through that practice. And it was so powerful, but we would never have been able to do that without that level of trust and willingness,
Right. Yeah.
to sit with that discomfort, because it's in the sitting with it that we're able to move through it instead of the avoiding it. It's like we're able to kind of move through it and shift it into growth, right?
Yeah.
And evolution. It's like, how do we move through those difficulties rather than avoiding? And I think so often the mainstream yoga culture is it kind of reinforces that idea of escaping,
Exactly.
avoiding. And I've talked to so many teachers who work at yoga studios that, they just want the teachers to create a bubble, an escape. And, there's nothing wrong with like getting away for a few hours by all means, like that's, that's fine. And yet I think the most powerful use of our practice is, how does it help us to engage with the difficulties and transform them into strength and compassion?
Yeah, it's in physiology, I think the term is hormesis, which is basically, and this is something that's seen as a good in science, right? What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I mean, that's how the body does develop, right? And that saying is something that I grew up with. I mean, Nietzsche also said it, apparently, all right? But now, I meet a lot of people who like just really bristle at that idea, even like, no, we shouldn't have to face anything. I was like, where on the planet are you going to find a place where you're not going to have to deal with it?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not to go to the other side that you have to like traumatize yourself to get stronger, but like this attempt to avoid at all costs, especially, is the real issue, I think. I mean, we just, I would often say we have one nervous system, right? And if we try to prevent ourselves from feeling, quote, negative emotions, how are we going to feel the positive ones? Right? We're just numbing ourselves, period, right?
Yeah. And I think that, that avoiding at all costs, that desire to stay comfortable in a certain way at all costs, it's reinforced by the capitalist marketplace, right?
Yeah. Try this. It's new and improved. It'll make you feel even better.
Yeah. So we have to keep so that's led to this situation we're in where we really can't anymore, that the conditions of this planet are such that I think we can't really, we can't sustain that anymore. And so I think that's another, opportunity and challenge of studentship in yoga right now, is that I really think we are in a position to really share tools and practices and understandings that can help bolster people to face this world that we're living in. And yet we have to be willing to, be in that place. We have to be willing as practitioners to be in that place of discomfort and to recognize the value of that, so that we can get the tools and the understandings to, move forward.
Yeah. Well, so in that spirit, as we move towards the ending, I think, rather than end on this like, okay, this is the diagnosis, you offer 5 essential attributes, and I really like them. So as a service to our listeners, maybe we can go through them and if you want to comment on any of them. But the first one you wrote is be willing to start again. And in, I was with Thich Nhat Hanh for about a little over a decade. And in that Plum Village tradition, every new and full moon, they do a beginning a new ceremony. My Sangha does it every 3 months. But this idea that, wherever we are, we can begin again. What did you have in mind when you put be willing to start again?
I put that first because I think it is again, my book is about, deepening yoga practice over time. And I think that's the most important attribute of a student, because we are going to get disconnected from the practice. There are going to be times when we fall away. And so, just by virtue of the fact that that will happen, if we want to continue over time, we have to be willing to start again.
Yeah.
And, I was thinking about that this morning because today's the new moon. And I've been reading about the qualities of this new moon, and then there's going to be the full moon. And I thought, how incredible is it? The earth has these rhythms that, nature herself is constantly in renewal, and there's a cyclical nature. So I think recognizing that, and we're part of that. So that's just the truth. That's that's the planet we live on. That's the nature of life, is that it's cyclical. And so there are endings and then there are new beginnings. And so I think we can take hold of that as students to just be able to continue over time. Right.
Yes. Yeah. It's funny because I sometimes, I'll point out at the beginning of a yoga class, no matter how many thousands of down dogs, for instance, downward facing dogs I've done, me right now, I've not done any, right today. So we're literally starting again every time we come to practice. And then in meditation, every time the mind wanders and we come back to whether it's our mantra or our breath or anything else, we're beginning again. And it's funny how people overlook that, the implications of that. We are always beginning again. And bringing more consciousness to that allows us to perhaps not carry the baggage forward too. It's like, okay, this is a fresh start.
It's such a great way to live. It's like, because it carries over, it's like you wake up in the morning and maybe not every morning, but it's like sometimes it happens. It's like, oh, another day, that newness, it keeps happening. And it's just a really enjoyable way to live.
Yeah. In the Avatamsaka Sutra, there's a whole chapter, and I never counted, but there's probably hundreds of gathas, these little verses. And Thich Nhat Hanh was big on use of gathas. He has a book about of gathas. And the first one is for like waking up, and it's like, I've passed this on to my students, and I said, it's first thought practice. And initially I have them write in their own handwritings and put it by their nightstand. And then they get out of bed, they sit up on the bed and they recite it to themselves. And eventually you memorize it, but it's literally like, waking this morning, a brand new day is before me. I aspire to live each moment fully present and to look upon all beings with the eyes of compassion. You take 3 breaths and then you get up and you go into your day. And it's like, you do that every day, and it's a true new beginning. It's really awesome practice. I've been doing it since 1990 or something.
Wow. So, for no other reason than just it makes life better.
Yes.
Right? Like it just helps.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
The second principle I love too, cultivate curiosity. When I was talking about the don't know mind, I was like, that's behind that is like curiosity. And when we're curious, there's I watched my daughter, especially when she was a child. I mean, kids, they're like curiosity personified. And it's like how engaged they are with what they're doing, and bringing that in. And in the in the 7 factors of awakening, the second factor after mindfulness is Dhammavicharya, which literally means like investigation of phenomena. And it's like there's a real curiosity. It's like I want to look into what is this. The most common hwadu or meditational phrase used in Korean Zen is "What is it?"
Mm.
And sometimes I'll do a whole yoga practice with my students based around that one wadu. It's like we get into a posture. It's like, what is it? Like if you feel something, don't immediately assume you know what it is. What is it? What is it that I'm really
Mhm.
feeling and all that? And
Mhm.
another way of really going deep.
I love that. I love that. Yeah. And the more we ask those questions, the more we develop that witnessing capacity, the observation capacity
mhm,
as well.
yeah.
Mhm.
The third one, I would change one word. I bet build faith based on your experience. And in your text, you do mention it as confidence or trust.
Mhm.
Um, and you know that to me is what I would emphasize. Faith or confidence, and you say based on your experience. So it's not blind faith that we're asking of our
Right.
students, right?
Right.
But there has to be some level of trust or confidence, or why would you even be there?
Right.
Um, when if I have to see a new doctor, a new specialist, I almost always find myself looking to see what school they graduated from, because they
Mhm.
usually, and it's like that is evidential confidence or trust, right? And I think I wanted to really tease that out because I think some of the guru scandals we've seen were the abdication of that in a more blind faith orientation. So,
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, for sure. No, yeah, I think the important part of that is reflecting on your own experience so that you build the trust in the practice itself.
mhm.
Um, you know, like if my lower back hurts, I know if I do downward facing dog, or you can't see my wall ropes, if I do downward facing dog over the wall rope, like that's gonna help. And I just trust that because I've been doing it for so
Yeah,
many years and I have complete faith in that. And it's not a blind faith.
right. Yeah.
So it has to involve discernment. It has to involve our responsibility, right, as
Hmm.
students,
Yeah.
to your point.
Yeah. And that needs to be applied to the teacher too. Like,
Yeah.
if I when I got involved with like Samu Sunim, I took a retreat with him to see how he was with other people. Oh, I did a lot of other things. I read any things he's written. I talked to other students before I became a formal student and took precepts with him.
Mhm, mhm.
And I remember the Dalai Lama saying how like you have to just investigate and see how your teacher is, not just immediately throw yourself over into it. So in terms of studentship, I think that's a responsibility on the student,
Definitely.
and
And I give all those questions, to ask of your teachers,
right,
um, to make sure,
yeah,
yeah, that is the responsibility of the student, I think. Yeah.
which you already said it, but discrimination or discernment, viveka.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
Now on page 33, duality between eternal essence and ever-changing world, you wrote. So my question for you is,
That's going to be next time.
yeah, we'll get
That's
more into
all.
that next time. But I was like, I wonder if Viveka could also be understood in a non-dual way, because I know it
Yeah.
can.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think of, the two truths doctrine,
yeah,
right? That we have this relative world of good and bad, and we have this other level
yeah,
where it's resolved.
yeah,
Right? So
yeah.
in the relative world, we have to use our discrimination.
Hmm. Well, even in our practice, like going back again, it's like there is a difference, and I think the ability to discern or discriminate is one of the skills that gets developed over time, to
Hmm.
see the difference between discomfort and pain. And then even a more subtle, like there's the pain of change, which might be a good thing to deal with, or the pain
Hmm.
of injury. And that's a real fine tuning of discrimination that's necessary for sure.
And it gets back to what we were saying, that it requires being in that place of discomfort a little bit,
Yeah.
being able to live with it, to see it's that, yeah, there's a kind of inner strength or fortitude that's required to develop that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess we could end with that last of the essential attributes of a yoga student, which goes right back to Svadhyaya, embrace a spirit of self-inquiry.
Yeah.
One of the most famous quotes from Dogen Zenji. He was a famous Zen master in Japan, 13th century. And he said the Zazen is sitting meditation in Zen. And he says Zazen is the study of the self, or investigating the self. The Japanese translations vary. And when you study the self or investigate the self, you lose the self. And in losing the self, you become intimate with the 10,000 things. Sometimes you see enlightened by all things, I like the intimate with. And 10,000 things is just Zen poetry for all phenomena. But the interesting paradox from the Zen perspective is that you really want to investigate the self so deeply that you see it in its true nature, which is empty.
Right.
So embracing.
Yeah, and I think that's a great note to end on, because I think that's really the promise of everything we're talking about. It's like being willing to sit with not knowing, not having a linear path, not kind of being open to the pure experience, with that inquiring mind is really what allows you to kind of go beyond those limitations, right?
Yeah. As we spiral deeper in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. And so that's on the other side of that is freedom, in my experience.
Yeah.
And lightness, and just, and being able to adapt to, the unexpected, right? And whatever situations we find ourselves in, it's like, how do we become more, how do we develop that alacrity, that willingness to respond to life?
Yeah. And through that self-inquiry, I think, for speaking for myself, begin to really see the commonality, right? It's ironically, it's like you develop. I think that's what Dogen's getting at with that intimacy with 10,000 things. It's like, when I have this passage in my book, Working with Difficult Emotions, and when I describe like hitting the sadness that was underneath my anxiety and fear and everything else, it was like, oh, but this is not my sadness. This is the sadness shared with all humanity, all life, and it's and to quote Sappho, it's a sweet, bitter sadness. I don't want to lose that, right, in a sense, because it's what holds the joy.
Yeah. And that's where we find our true belonging.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Barrie.
Thank you.
Don't hang up yet, but I'm going to stop recording, and I look forward to continuing.
Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. Barrie and I will be back in the future to look at some more of the principles for enlightened practice that you can find in her book, Evolving Your Yoga. So again, thank you, and may you stay well. So thank you for stopping by at Pobsa's Dharma Lounge. Please remember to subscribe, comment, share, and speak about it. Word of mouth is the best way to get the word out. If you think there's anybody who might be interested or who might benefit from checking in at Bubs's Dharma Lounge.